I'm Maya, and I'm 28 years old, standing in what used to be my childhood bedroom, staring at my wedding dress hanging on the closet door. In 3 hours, I'll be walking down the aisle to marry the love of my life. But right now, all I can hear are my mother's words echoing in my head from last night's rehearsal dinner. Well, at least someone will marry you, even if this whole thing is rather pathetic. The sting of those words hasn't faded, and neither has the embarrassment of watching my family treat my fiancé like he was some kind of charity case they had to tolerate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the affluent suburb of Westfield Heights, I learned early that appearances mattered more than anything else in the Chen family. My parents, Margaret and Robert Chen, had built their lives around maintaining a perfect facade for their circle of wealthy friends and business associates. My father owned a successful chain of high-end furniture stores across the state, and my mother dedicated herself to charity galas, country club committees, and ensuring our family's reputation remained spotless within our social circle. From the time I could walk, I was groomed to be the perfect daughter. Piano lessons, ballet classes, etiquette training, and enrollment in the most prestigious private schools money could buy. My older brother Kevin excelled at everything effortlessly, earning acceptance to Harvard Business School and eventually taking over much of our father's business operations. Meanwhile, I struggled to find my place in this world of expectations and rigid social hierarchies. The first crack in my perfect daughter facade appeared during my sophomore year at Northwestern University when I decided to change my major from business to social work. The phone call home announcing this decision resulted in a 3-hour lecture from my father about throwing away opportunities and disappointing the family. My mother's response was even worse, a cold silence that lasted for weeks, punctuated only by pointed comments about how I was wasting my expensive education on a career that would never provide the lifestyle I'd been raised to expect. Despite their disapproval, I persevered with my studies, finding genuine passion in working with underprivileged communities and advocating for social justice causes. After graduation, I took a position with a nonprofit organization in Chicago, focused on providing housing assistance to homeless families. The work was demanding and emotionally challenging, but it gave me a sense of purpose I'd never experienced in my carefully orchestrated childhood. My parents tolerated my career choice as what they hoped would be a temporary phase, something I'd grow out of once I found a suitable husband from an appropriate family. They constantly arranged introductions to young men from their social circle, sons of business partners and country club members who they deemed worthy of the Chen family name. These awkward dinner dates and charity event encounters felt like business transactions rather than romantic possibilities, and I found myself increasingly resistant to their matchmaking efforts. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday morning in October when I was volunteering at a community kitchen downtown. I was serving breakfast to a line of people seeking a warm meal when I noticed a man who seemed different from our usual guests. He was clean-shaven, wearing clothes that, while simple, appeared to be good quality, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that caught my attention. When he reached my station, he looked up with the kindest brown eyes I'd ever seen and said, "Thank you for doing this. It means more than you know." His name was Daniel Rodriguez, and I learned that he wasn't actually homeless but had been volunteering at the kitchen for over 2 years. He worked as a mechanic at a small auto repair shop on the South Side and spent his free time helping at various community organizations throughout the city. We struck up a conversation during our break, and I found myself captivated by his genuine warmth and his stories about the people he helped through his volunteer work. Daniel possessed a natural empathy and understanding of human struggle that came from his own experiences growing up in a working-class family. His parents had immigrated from Mexico when he was 5 years old, and his father worked multiple jobs to support the family, while his mother cleaned houses during the day and took English classes at night. Despite the financial hardships, Daniel spoke about his childhood with love and gratitude, describing a family rich in affection and support, even when money was scarce. As we continued volunteering together over the following weeks, I found myself looking forward to our conversations with an anticipation I'd never felt before. Daniel had a way of seeing the world that challenged my perspectives and opened my eyes to experiences far removed from my privileged upbringing. He spoke passionately about social justice, about the dignity of hard work, and about the importance of using whatever privileges we had to help others who were less fortunate. Our first official date was at a small Mexican restaurant in his neighborhood, a place his family had been going to for decades. The atmosphere was warm and lively, filled with the sounds of Spanish conversation and the aroma of authentic home-cooked food. Daniel introduced me to the owners, who greeted him like family, and I watched as he effortlessly connected with everyone around us, from the elderly man at the next table to the young waitress who was clearly struggling with her English. Sitting across from Daniel in that modest restaurant, sharing stories over plates of the most delicious food I'd ever tasted, I felt something I'd never experienced in any of the upscale establishments my parents frequented. I felt genuinely happy, authentically myself, without the constant pressure to maintain appearances or say the right things to impress the right people. Daniel listened to my stories about growing up in Westfield Heights without judgment, asking thoughtful questions about my experiences and sharing his own childhood memories with equal openness. As our relationship deepened over the following months, I found myself living a double life. With Daniel, I discovered parts of myself I never knew existed. We spent weekends exploring different neighborhoods in Chicago, visiting museums and art galleries, attending community festivals, and volunteering together at various organizations. He introduced me to his world gradually, taking me to family gatherings where I was welcomed with warmth and curiosity, despite our obvious cultural and economic differences. Daniel's family embraced me completely from our first meeting. His mother, Elena, insisted I call her Mama Elena, and immediately began teaching me how to make her famous tamales. His father, Carlos, shared stories about his journey to America and his pride in Daniel's accomplishments, treating me like a daughter rather than an outsider. Daniel's younger sister, Sophia, a nursing student, became like the sister I'd never had, and we spent hours talking about our career aspirations and dreams for the future. The contrast between Daniel's family and my own became increasingly stark as our relationship progressed. While the Rodriguez family operated with an openness and warmth that made everyone feel included, my family maintained their rigid social boundaries and expectations. I delayed introducing Daniel to my parents, for as long as possible, knowing instinctively that they would judge him based on his background rather than his character. When I finally brought Daniel home for dinner 6 months into our relationship, the evening was even more uncomfortable than I'd anticipated. My mother greeted him with polite coldness, asking pointed questions about his family's background and his career prospects. My father barely acknowledged his presence, making dismissive comments about the automotive industry and expressing bewilderment about why I was wasting time with someone who clearly couldn't provide the lifestyle I deserved. Daniel handled their interrogation with grace and dignity, answering their questions honestly and respectfully despite their obvious disapproval. He complimented my mother's cooking, engaged my father in conversation about business economics, and showed genuine interest in Kevin's work at the furniture company. His efforts to connect with my family only seemed to irritate them further, as if his refusal to be intimidated by their wealth and status was somehow presumptuous. After Daniel left that evening, my parents wasted no time expressing their concerns about our relationship. My mother launched into a lengthy speech about the importance of marrying within our social class, citing examples of family friends whose daughters had married beneath them and supposedly lived to regret it. My father was more direct, telling me bluntly that Daniel was a nice young man but entirely unsuitable as a potential husband for someone of my background and expectations. Their disapproval only strengthened my resolve to continue the relationship. The more time I spent with Daniel and his family, the more I realized how superficial and hollow my own family's values had become. While my parents obsessed over country, club memberships, and charity board positions, Daniel's family focused on genuine connection, mutual support, and making meaningful contributions to their community. Daniel proposed to me on a snowy evening in December, exactly 1 year after. We'd first met at the community kitchen. He took me back to that same restaurant where we'd had our first date, and after dinner, he got down on one knee right there in front of everyone. The ring was simple but beautiful, a classic solitaire that he'd saved for months to afford. As the other diners applauded and the restaurant owners brought out champagne to celebrate, I felt overwhelmed with joy and love for this incredible man who saw me for who I truly was. When I called my parents to share the news of our engagement, their reaction was predictably disappointing. My mother's first question was about the ring, and I could hear the judgment in her voice when I described its modest size and simple setting. My father immediately began questioning Daniel's ability to support me in the manner to which I was accustomed, suggesting that perhaps I should wait a few more years to see if Daniel's financial situation improved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Their response to our engagement announcement was in stark contrast to Daniel's family's celebration. The Rodriguez family threw an impromptu party that lasted until the early hours of the morning, with neighbors and friends stopping by to congratulate us and share in our joy. Mama Elena cried tears of happiness and immediately began planning traditional elements for our wedding, while Carlos welcomed me officially into the family with a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Planning the wedding became a source of constant tension between Daniel and me on one side and my family on the other. My mother insisted on taking control of most of the arrangements, booking venues and vendors without consulting us and dismissing our preferences as unrealistic or inappropriate. When we expressed interest in incorporating some Mexican traditions into the ceremony, she responded with barely concealed horror, suggesting that such elements would be confusing and uncomfortable for our guests. The guest list became another battleground. My parents wanted to invite their entire social circle, business associates, and country club friends, most of whom I barely knew. Meanwhile, they questioned every name Daniel and I added to the list, making snide comments about the appropriateness of having too many of his family members and friends at what they considered to be primarily a Chen family event. The most hurtful part of the planning process was watching my parents treat Daniel like an inconvenience rather than the groom. They scheduled vendor meetings without including him, made decisions about the reception menu without considering his family's dietary preferences, and consistently referred to it as my wedding rather than our wedding. When Daniel suggested including a mariachi band for part of the reception, my father actually laughed and said it would be like having a circus at a formal event. Despite the constant criticism and undermining from my family, Daniel remained patient and understanding. He never complained about their treatment of him, instead focusing on supporting me through the stress and reminding me that the wedding was just one day, but our marriage would last a lifetime. His maturity and grace in the face of my family's hostility only made me love him more and confirmed that I was making the right choice in marrying him. As the wedding date approached, my parents' disapproval became increasingly vocal and hurtful. During the rehearsal dinner, hosted at the country club where my family held their membership, the tension reached a breaking point. My mother had invited several of her friends to attend, and throughout the evening, I overheard whispered conversations and sideways glances directed at Daniel's family members, who were clearly being treated as unwelcome outsiders. The final straw came during the toasts at the rehearsal dinner. After Kevin gave a lukewarm speech about wishing us happiness, my father stood up to address the gathered guests. Instead of offering congratulations or expressing joy about our upcoming marriage, he delivered what amounted to a backhanded toast that emphasized how different Daniel was from the kind of man they'd expected me to marry. He made pointed references to the importance of hard work and perseverance, implying that Daniel would need both to measure up to our family's standards. When Daniel's father, Carlos, stood to respond with his own toast, speaking beautifully about love transcending all boundaries and welcoming me into their family with open arms, the contrast between the two families became painfully obvious to everyone present. While Carlos spoke from the heart about the joy of seeing his son find true love, my father's speech had been calculated to establish dominance and superiority. The most devastating moment came at the end of the evening, when my mother pulled me aside for what she claimed was a heart-to-heart conversation. Standing in the country club's elegant powder room, surrounded by the luxury I'd grown up taking for granted, she delivered the words that would haunt me through our wedding day. "Maya, darling, I know you think you love this boy, but you're making a terrible mistake. This whole wedding is rather pathetic, honestly. You're settling for someone who can never give you the life you deserve, and everyone here can see it. At least someone will marry you, even if it means we have to pretend this is something to celebrate." Her words hit me like a physical blow, not just because of their cruelty, but because they revealed the depth of her disapproval and the extent to which she was willing to hurt me to express it. I stood there in that marble-clad bathroom, wearing a designer dress that cost more than Daniel made in a month, and realized that my mother cared more about appearances and social status than my happiness or well-being. I didn't tell Daniel about my mother's comments that night, not wanting to burden him with the knowledge of just how cruel my family could be. Instead, I lay awake thinking about the journey that had brought us to this point, and the choice I was making to build a life with someone who valued love, authenticity, and genuine human connection over wealth and social position. The morning of our wedding dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring day that seemed to promise good fortune for our future together. As I sat in my childhood bedroom, looking at my wedding dress and thinking about the day ahead, I made a conscious decision to focus on the joy of marrying Daniel, rather than the pain of my family's disapproval. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew that choosing love over expectation was the right decision, even if my family couldn't understand or support it. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 4 o'clock at St. Catherine's Episcopal Church, a beautiful stone building where my family had been members for generations. The reception would follow at the Westfield Heights Country Club, a venue my mother had insisted upon despite Daniel's and my preference for something less formal and more inclusive. As I prepared to walk down the aisle to marry the man I loved, I tried to push aside my mother's hurtful words and focus on the commitment Daniel and I were making to each other. Little did I know that the events of our wedding day would unfold, in ways none of us could have anticipated, revealing truths that would forever change not only how my family saw Daniel, but how they understood the meaning of true worth and genuine class. The surprises that awaited us would challenge every assumption my parents had made about wealth, status, and what it truly means to belong to a distinguished family. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains of my childhood bedroom as I sat surrounded by wedding preparations that felt more like a performance than a celebration. My mother had hired a team of stylists who buzzed around me like busy bees, transforming me into what she considered the perfect bride. The makeup artist applied layer after layer of foundation, while the hairstylist crafted an elaborate updo that required enough hairspray to withstand a hurricane. Every detail had been orchestrated to meet my mother's exacting standards, rather than reflect my personal preferences. Sofia Rodriguez, Daniel's sister and my maid of honor, sat quietly in the corner watching the transformation with barely concealed amusement. She looked stunning in the bridesmaid dress my mother had selected, a pale blue creation that cost more than Sophia's monthly rent, but which she wore with natural grace. The contrast between Sophia's genuine warmth and the cold efficiency of my mother's hired help was striking, and I found myself wishing I could dismiss everyone else and just spend these precious hours before my wedding, talking with the woman who had become my dearest friend. My cousin Jessica, whom my mother had insisted on including in the bridal party despite our lack of closeness, scrolled through her phone while occasionally making comments about the wedding arrangements. She had attended the same private schools as me and shared my mother's values about social hierarchy and appropriate marriages. Her presence in my bridal suite felt like having a spy reporting back to my mother about every detail of the morning's preparations. The tension in the room was palpable as my mother flitted between directing the stylists and making pointed comments about various aspects of the wedding that didn't meet her approval. She criticized the flower arrangements that Daniel and I had selected together, complained about the musician choices for the ceremony, and expressed disappointment that more of her social circle hadn't confirmed their attendance. Each criticism felt like another small cut, reminding me that even on my wedding day, nothing I did would ever be quite good enough for her standards. Elena Rodriguez arrived at 10 o'clock carrying a small velvet box and wearing a smile that could have lit up the entire room. Daniel's mother had become like a second mother to me over the past 18 months, providing the unconditional love and support that my own mother seemed incapable of offering. She embraced me carefully to avoid disturbing the stylist's work, but her hug conveyed more genuine affection than I'd received from my own family in months. The velvet box contained a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to Daniel's grandmother, a woman who had raised 5 children while working as a seamstress to support the family during the Great Depression. Elena explained that these earrings had been worn by every bride in the Rodriguez family for 3 generations, and she wanted me to have them as a symbol of my inclusion in their family traditions. The simple elegance of the pearls stood in stark contrast to the elaborate diamond jewelry my mother had selected for me to wear, but they carried a weight of love and history that made them infinitely more precious. My mother's reaction to Elena's gift was predictably dismissive. She glanced at the pearls with barely concealed disdain and suggested that they might not photograph well with the rest of my jewelry. Elena's face fell slightly at the rude response, but she maintained her composure with the dignity that characterized everything about Daniel's family. I immediately removed one of the diamond bracelets my mother had insisted I wear and replaced it with the pearl earrings, looking directly at my mother as I made the substitution. The morning continued with a series of photographs that felt more like a fashion shoot than intimate wedding preparations. The photographer, another of my mother's expensive selections, posed us in artificial arrangements while commenting on lighting and angles, rather than capturing genuine moments of joy and anticipation. When Elena asked if she could take some candid photos with her own camera, my mother quickly intervened, explaining that all photography needed to be coordinated through the professional to ensure consistency. Around noon, my bridesmaids and I gathered for the traditional brunch that my mother had arranged in the country club's private dining room. The space was elegantly appointed with crystal chandeliers and oil paintings of long-dead club members, but the atmosphere felt more like a business meeting than a celebration. My mother's friends dominated the conversation, discussing their own daughters' weddings and offering unsolicited advice about marriage that revealed more about their own unhappiness than any wisdom worth sharing. Sophia sat quietly during most of the brunch, occasionally catching my eye with supportive smiles, but clearly feeling out of place among these women who measured success by the size of their diamonds and the exclusivity of their social connections. When one of my mother's friends asked Sophia about her career plans, the conversation that followed highlighted the vast cultural divide that separated our families. Sophia spoke passionately about her nursing studies and her desire to work in community health, while the other women exchanged glances that suggested they found such ambitions quaint, but ultimately pointless. The most uncomfortable moment came when my Aunt Patricia, my father's sister, arrived late to the brunch and immediately began sharing gossip about other family members who had married outside their social circle. She regaled the table with stories about cousins whose marriages had supposedly failed because they'd chosen partners from inappropriate backgrounds, each tale delivered with pointed glances in my direction. The implication was clear that my choice to marry Daniel was being viewed as another cautionary tale in the making. I excused myself from the brunch early, claiming I needed time to rest before the ceremony, but really needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere of judgment and disapproval. Sophia followed me out of the dining room, and we found a quiet corner in the country club's garden where we could speak privately. For the first time all day, I felt like I could breathe normally without the weight of my mother's expectations pressing down on my shoulders. Sophia took my hands in hers and looked directly into my eyes with the kind of honesty that had made me love Daniel's family from our first meeting. She told me that she could see how difficult this morning had been for me, surrounded by people who seemed more interested in critiquing my choices than celebrating my happiness. She reminded me that in just a few hours, I would be married to her brother, who loved me more than anything in the world, and that their entire family was thrilled to welcome me as a daughter and sister. We talked about the differences between our families and how challenging it had been to navigate the planning process while trying to honor both sets of traditions and expectations. Sophia shared stories about other family weddings where love had triumphed over social barriers, reminding me that what mattered most was the commitment Daniel and I were making to each other, not the approval of people who couldn't see past their own prejudices. As we sat in the garden, Sophia revealed something that her family had been discussing but hadn't shared with me directly. They were all aware of how poorly my family had treated Daniel throughout our relationship, and they'd been concerned about how this treatment might affect our marriage. However, they'd decided to trust in the strength of our love and to focus on providing the support and acceptance that my own family seemed unable to offer. The conversation was interrupted by Jessica, who appeared in the garden looking slightly panicked and announced that my mother was looking for me. Apparently, the photographer wanted to begin the formal bridal portraits, and my absence had been noted with displeasure. Sophia and I exchanged a meaningful look before returning to the country club, both of us understanding that the performance was about to resume. The afternoon portrait session was an exercise in endurance as the photographer arranged and rearranged us in various combinations, while my mother provided running commentary about poses and expressions. The photos with my immediate family felt stiff and formal, everyone smiling on command but without any genuine warmth or joy visible in their eyes. When Daniel's family arrived for their portion of the portraits, the difference in energy was immediately apparent. Elena and Carlos brought flowers from their garden, beautiful blooms that they'd grown and arranged themselves as their contribution to the wedding decorations. The gesture was simple but heartfelt, representing hours of care and attention that they'd devoted to making my day special. My mother accepted the flowers with polite thanks, but immediately handed them to one of the club's staff members to be incorporated into the existing arrangements in whatever way wouldn't disrupt her carefully planned aesthetic. The Rodriguez family portraits captured genuine emotion and connection that had been absent from the earlier photos. Daniel's grandparents, who had traveled from Texas for the wedding, beamed with pride as they posed with their extended family. His cousins and aunts embraced me with real affection, treating me like a beloved family member rather than a stranger to be tolerated. The photographer even commented on how much easier it was to capture natural smiles and genuine happiness with this group. During a brief break in the photography session, my father pulled me aside for what he claimed would be our traditional father-daughter conversation before the ceremony. I hoped that this private moment might offer an opportunity for him to express genuine support for my marriage, or at least acknowledge his appreciation for Daniel's character. Instead, the conversation became another lecture about the practical considerations of marriage and the importance of financial security. My father explained that he'd been having second thoughts about my decision to marry Daniel, not because he disliked him personally, but because he worried about my future happiness. He painted a picture of financial struggle and social isolation that awaited me as the wife of a mechanic, suggesting that love alone wouldn't be enough to sustain a marriage when practical difficulties arose. His words were delivered with what he probably considered fatherly concern, but they felt like another attempt to undermine my confidence in my choice. When I tried to explain that Daniel and I had discussed our financial future extensively and had realistic plans for building a life together, my father dismissed my optimism as naive romanticism. He suggested that I was too sheltered by my privileged upbringing to understand the realities of living on a working-class income. The irony of this criticism wasn't lost on me. considering that my work in social services had exposed me to far more economic diversity than my father's insulated business world. The conversation ended with my father making one final attempt to change my mind about the marriage. He offered to postpone the wedding indefinitely, claiming that he would handle all the explanations to the guests and vendors if I decided that I wasn't ready to go through with the ceremony. The offer was presented as concern for my well-being, but it felt more like a last-ditch effort to prevent what he saw as a mistake that would reflect poorly on the family's reputation. I thanked my father for his concern, but firmly declined his offer to cancel the wedding. I explained that my love for Daniel wasn't based on naive romanticism, but on 18 months of getting to know him as a person of integrity, kindness, and strength. I told him that while I appreciated the comfortable life my family had provided, I'd learned that true happiness came from authentic relationships and shared values, rather than material possessions and social status. My father's expression remained skeptical throughout my explanation, and I could see that he viewed my words as confirmation of his fears about my poor judgment. The conversation ended with an awkward hug and his promise to support whatever decision I made, though his tone suggested that this support would be given reluctantly and with continuing reservations about my choice. As the afternoon progressed toward the ceremony time, the final preparations took on an increasingly frantic pace. The florists made last-minute adjustments to the church decorations, while the catering staff at the country club set up for the party reception. My mother supervised every detail with military precision, ensuring that each element met her exacting standards while expressing frustration about any deviation from her original vision. The most stressful moment came when the string quartet that was supposed to play during the ceremony called to report that their first violinist was ill and couldn't perform. My mother's reaction was disproportionate to the actual problem, treating this minor setback as a catastrophic failure that would ruin the entire wedding. She spent 30 minutes on the phone with various musicians trying to arrange a replacement, becoming increasingly agitated when the available alternatives didn't meet her standards for prestige and reputation. Daniel, who had arrived at the church early to help with final setup, quietly solved the problem by calling a friend who played guitar at local venues. Within an hour, he had arranged for a small acoustic ensemble that would provide beautiful, if less formal, music for the ceremony. When my mother learned about this solution, she was initially horrified by the prospect of having non-classical musicians at her daughter's wedding, but time constraints forced her to accept the arrangement. The incident highlighted the fundamental difference in problem-solving approaches between my family and Daniel's. While my mother had focused on maintaining appearances and finding prestigious replacements, Daniel had prioritized finding a practical solution that would ensure we had beautiful music for our ceremony. His ability to remain calm under pressure and find creative solutions to unexpected challenges was one of the many qualities that had made me fall in love with him. As the time for the ceremony approached, I found myself in the church's bridal room making final adjustments to my dress and veil. The elaborate gown my mother had selected was undeniably beautiful, but it felt like a costume rather than an expression of my personal style. The layers of silk and lace weighed heavily on my shoulders, and the intricate beadwork caught on everything I touched. I couldn't help but think about the simple, elegant dress I'd originally wanted, which my mother had dismissed as insufficiently formal for a Chen family wedding. Sophia helped me with the final touches, adjusting my veil and ensuring that the pearl earrings were secure. Her presence provided a calming influence in the midst of the pre-ceremony chaos, and her quiet confidence reminded me of what really mattered about this day. As we prepared to leave the bridal room, she squeezed my hand and reminded me that in a few minutes, I would be walking toward the man who loved me completely and unconditionally. The church was filled with guests when we arrived in the narthex, and I could hear the sound of conversation and laughter drifting from the sanctuary. My mother did a final inspection of my appearance, making minute adjustments to my dress and reminding me to smile naturally for the photographer who would be capturing every moment of the processional. Her instructions felt more like directions for a performance than preparation for a sacred ceremony. My bridesmaids lined up for the processional, each holding a bouquet of white roses that my mother had selected for their classic elegance. Sophia looked radiant in her bridesmaid dress, but I could see the concern in her eyes as she watched my mother continue to fuss over details that seemed insignificant compared to the magnitude of the commitment I was about to make. The contrast between Sophia's genuine emotional investment in my happiness and my mother's focus on superficial perfection was striking. As the music began and the processional started, I watched my bridesmaids walk down the aisle toward the altar where Daniel was waiting. Through the open doors of the sanctuary, I could see him standing at the front of the church, looking handsome and nervous in the tuxedo we'd selected together. His face lit up with joy as each bridesmaid appeared, knowing that my appearance would follow shortly. The moment arrived for my father and me to begin our walk down the aisle, and I felt a complex mixture of emotions as I took his arm. Despite our disagreements about my choice to marry Daniel, my father was still the man who had raised me and provided for my education and opportunities. I hoped that seeing Daniel and me exchange vows might help him understand that our love was real and worthy of his support, even if our marriage didn't fit his expectations for my future. As we stepped into the sanctuary and began walking toward the altar, I was struck by the beauty of the scene that awaited us. The church was filled with flowers, candles, and the warm glow of afternoon sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. The acoustic ensemble that Daniel had arranged was playing a beautiful melody that filled the space with music that felt both elegant and heartfelt. Most importantly, Daniel was waiting for me at the altar with an expression of pure love and joy that made my heart race with anticipation. The congregation stood as we walked down the aisle, and I could see the faces of people from both of our families and circles of friends. My mother's guests from the country club and business community were impeccably dressed and properly positioned, but their expressions seemed more curious than celebratory. In contrast, Daniel's family and friends beamed with genuine happiness, many of them wiping away tears of joy as they watched us approach the altar. Halfway down the aisle, I noticed something that would later prove to be significant, but seemed merely interesting at the time. There were several guests in the back of the church whom I didn't recognize, well-dressed individuals who appeared to be watching the ceremony with particular attention. I assumed they were friends of Daniel's family, or perhaps colleagues from his work, though their formal attire seemed unusually elegant for mechanics and community volunteers. As my father and I reached the altar, Daniel stepped forward to greet us with a smile that conveyed both respect for my father and overwhelming love for me. The handoff from father to groom was accomplished with formal courtesy, though I could sense the continued tension between the two men who mattered most in my life. Daniel's eyes never left mine during this transition, silently communicating his commitment to cherishing and protecting me throughout our marriage. The ceremony began with traditional Episcopal liturgy that my mother had insisted upon, delivered by Reverend Matthews, who had baptized me as an infant and confirmed me as a teenager. His words about the sacred nature of marriage and the commitment we were making to each other resonated deeply, despite the formal setting that felt somewhat at odds with the more personal ceremony Daniel and I had originally envisioned. When it came time for our personal vows, both Daniel and I had written words that reflected our genuine feelings rather than traditional language suggested by the church. Daniel spoke first, his voice strong and clear as he promised to love me, not just for who I was, but for who I was becoming through our relationship. He talked about how I had opened his eyes to new possibilities while he had helped me discover my authentic self. His words brought tears to my eyes and audible sighs of appreciation from the congregation. My own vows focused on the courage Daniel had given me to choose love over expectation and authenticity over appearance. I promised to build a life with him based on shared values and mutual respect, creating a family that would welcome others with the same warmth and acceptance his family had shown me. As I spoke these words, I could see my mother's disapproving expression in my peripheral vision, but I felt liberated by finally speaking my truth in front of everyone who mattered to us. The exchange of rings proceeded smoothly, with each of us placing simple gold bands on the other's finger while repeating ancient promises of fidelity and devotion. Daniel's hands were steady as he slipped the ring onto my finger, but I could see the emotion in his eyes as we completed this symbolic union. The rings were modest compared to the elaborate jewelry my family typically favored, but they represented our commitment to building a marriage based on substance rather than symbols of wealth. Reverend Matthews pronounced us husband and wife, and Daniel and I shared our first kiss as a married couple to enthusiastic applause from the congregation. The joy I felt in that moment was pure and overwhelming, unmarred by any of the tensions that had surrounded the planning process. For those precious seconds, there was only Daniel and me and the love we shared, everything else fading into insignificance. As we turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, the recessional music began, and we started our walk back down the aisle together. The faces looking back at us showed a mixture of emotions, from genuine celebration to polite approval to what appeared to be resignation on the part of some of my family members. Daniel's family was openly weeping with joy, while many of my mother's guests maintained the composed expressions appropriate to their social station. The receiving line outside the church provided our first opportunity to greet our guests as a married couple, and the difference in responses from the two sides of our families was immediately apparent. Daniel's relatives and friends embraced us both warmly, offering heartfelt congratulations and expressing their excitement about welcoming me into their family. My family's guests were more restrained, offering polite congratulations while making comments about the lovely ceremony and beautiful flowers. Several of my mother's friends made pointed inquiries about our honeymoon plans and future living arrangements, questions that seemed designed to highlight the modest nature of our financial circumstances. When Daniel mentioned that we would be spending our honeymoon camping in national parks rather than traveling to European resorts, the responses ranged from confused surprise to barely concealed pity. Their inability to understand that we had chosen this adventure because it reflected our shared love of nature and simple pleasures spoke volumes about the values gap between our families. The most memorable moment in the receiving line came when those unidentified guests from the back of the church approached to congratulate us. The group was led by an elegant elderly gentleman who introduced himself as Charles Morrison, followed by several other individuals whose names meant nothing to me but seemed to surprise some of the other guests. They congratulated us warmly and mentioned looking forward to seeing us at the reception, leaving me curious about their connection to our wedding. As the receiving line concluded and we prepared to leave for the country club reception, I felt a mixture of relief that the ceremony had gone smoothly and anxiety about the evening ahead. The reception would provide even more opportunities for the social dynamics between our families to play out, and I worried about how Daniel would be treated by my parents' friends in a less formal setting. However, I was determined to focus on celebrating our marriage rather than managing other people's discomfort with our choices. The drive from the church to the country club gave Daniel and me our first private moments as husband and wife, and we used the time to decompress from the intensity of the ceremony and prepare for the reception ahead. Daniel told me how beautiful I looked and how proud he was to be my husband, while I shared my appreciation for how gracefully he had handled all the challenges and tensions of the wedding planning process. We agreed to focus on enjoying our celebration and not let anyone else's negativity diminish our joy. As our car pulled up to the country club, I could see that my mother had spared no expense in creating an elegant reception venue. The building was draped with lights and flowers, and valets were ready to assist guests with parking and arrival. Everything looked perfect from the outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the evening would bring new challenges as our very different families and social circles came together in one space for an extended celebration. The country club's grand ballroom had been transformed into what my mother considered the epitome of wedding elegance, with crystal chandeliers casting sparkles across tables draped in ivory silk and centerpieces of white orchids that had been flown in from Hawaii. The cost of this single evening's decoration could have funded Daniel's auto shop for several months, a fact that wasn't lost on me as we entered the reception space to scattered applause from the assembled guests. The cocktail hour was already in full swing when Daniel and I made our entrance as the newly married couple. The string quartet had been replaced by a jazz ensemble, their smooth melodies providing background music for the conversations taking place throughout the elegantly appointed space. Servers in crisp white uniforms circulated with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that represented my mother's idea of sophisticated entertaining, each bite probably costing more than most people spent on an entire meal. I watched Daniel take in the opulent surroundings with what I recognized as his characteristic composure, though I could sense his discomfort with the excessive display of wealth. His family had gathered near the bar, looking somewhat out of place among the country club's usual clientele, but maintaining their dignity despite the obvious stares and whispered comments from some of my mother's friends. Elena wore a simple but elegant dress that she had sewn herself, and she looked absolutely radiant despite being surrounded by women wearing designer gowns that cost more than her monthly salary. The social dynamics of the cocktail hour played out exactly as I had feared they would. My parents' friends clustered together in their familiar groups, occasionally glancing toward Daniel's family with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed condescension. Meanwhile, Daniel's relatives and friends formed their own circle, speaking in Spanish and English while clearly feeling like outsiders at what was supposed to be a celebration of their beloved family member's marriage. The most painful moment came when I overheard a conversation between two of my mother's closest friends, women who had known me since childhood, but apparently felt free to discuss my marriage choices within earshot of other guests. They were questioning Daniel's ability to provide for me in the manner to which I was accustomed, speculating about how long our marriage would last once the romantic illusions wore off and practical realities set in. Their words cut deeply, not just because of their cruelty, but because they reflected the attitudes I had been fighting against throughout our entire relationship. Daniel handled the subtle and not-so-subtle slights with remarkable grace, engaging in polite conversation with my family's friends when they approached him and never letting their condescending questions ruffle his composure. When one of my father's business associates asked him about his little garage business, with obvious dismissiveness, Daniel responded by explaining his work with genuine pride and describing his plans for expanding the shop's services to better serve the community. His dignity in the face of such disrespect made me love him even more, while simultaneously making me ashamed of my family's behavior. The mysterious guests I had noticed at the church were mingling easily with both sides of our families, and I found myself increasingly curious about their identities. The elderly gentleman who had introduced himself as Charles Morrison was engaged in animated conversation with Daniel's father, Carlos, speaking what appeared to be fluent Spanish and showing genuine interest in Carlos's stories about his journey to America. The other members of their group were equally engaging, treating everyone they met with the same courtesy and respect, regardless of their obvious social or economic status. My mother's attempts to manage the social dynamics of the cocktail hour were becoming increasingly obvious and embarrassing. She guided certain guests toward conversations with people she deemed appropriate, while subtly steering others away from interactions that might not meet her standards. When she noticed Charles Morrison and his companions speaking with Daniel's family, she quickly inserted herself into the conversation with the kind of practiced smile she reserved for people whose importance she was trying to assess. The introduction between my mother and Charles Morrison was fascinating to observe. While my mother launched into her usual routine of establishing social credentials and mutual acquaintances, Charles listened politely, but seemed more interested in asking about our families and the story of how Daniel and I had met. His questions were thoughtful and genuine, focusing on the personal rather than the superficial details that typically dominated country club conversations. When my mother attempted to guide Charles toward the more prominent guests at the reception, he politely declined, explaining that he was perfectly content continuing his conversation with the Rodriguez family. This response clearly confused my mother, who couldn't understand why someone of his apparent sophistication would choose to spend time with what she considered the less important guests at the party. Her frustration was visible as she excused herself to attend to other hosting duties, leaving Charles to continue his conversation with Daniel's parents. The call to dinner interrupted the cocktail hour dynamics, and guests began moving toward their assigned tables. My mother had spent considerable time crafting the seating arrangements, carefully placing people according to her perception of their social importance and compatibility. Daniel and I were seated at the head table with our immediate families and wedding party, while the other guests were distributed throughout the ballroom according to my mother's complex social calculus. I noticed that Charles Morrison and his companions had been seated at a table near the center of the room, positioned in a way that suggested my mother was uncertain about their status, but didn't want to risk offending potentially important guests by placing them too far from the action. Their table companions included some of my father's business associates and a few family friends, creating an interesting mix that would prove to be more significant than anyone realized at the time. The dinner service began with my mother's carefully selected menu of French cuisine, each course presented with the kind of elaborate garnishes and artistic plating that characterized upscale catering. The food was undoubtedly delicious, but it felt disconnected from any meaningful celebration of our marriage or acknowledgement of our family's cultural backgrounds. When Daniel's grandmother quietly asked Sophia to translate the menu descriptions, I realized how exclusionary even our meal choices had become under my mother's direction. During the salad course, my father stood to deliver the traditional father of the bride toast, and I braced myself for what I feared would be another backhanded speech that revealed more about his reservations than his joy. His words were carefully chosen and formally correct, touching on my childhood accomplishments and expressing hope for my future happiness. However, his tone remained distant and somewhat resigned, as if he were delivering remarks about a business merger rather than celebrating his daughter's marriage to the love of her life. The response from Daniel's father, Carlos, was dramatically different in both content and delivery. He spoke with genuine emotion about watching Daniel grow into a man of integrity and compassion, and he welcomed me into their family with words that brought tears to my eyes. Carlos talked about the importance of love that transcends all boundaries, and the joy of seeing two people find in each other the kind of partnership that strengthens both individuals. His toast was heartfelt and authentic, delivered in both English and Spanish to ensure that all of his family members could understand and participate in the moment. The contrast between the two fathers' toasts was obvious to everyone in the ET room, and I could see guests responding differently to each speaker. My mother's friends applauded politely for both men, but their expressions suggested they found Carlos's emotional delivery somewhat excessive for the formal setting. Meanwhile, Daniel's family and friends were visibly moved by both speeches, responding with warmth and enthusiasm regardless of the speaker's relationship to them. As the dinner continued, I found myself observing the interactions between our guests with growing concern about the social divisions that were becoming increasingly apparent. The conversations at tables dominated by my family's friends focused on business dealings, recent vacations to exotic locations, and gossip about mutual acquaintances. Meanwhile, the tables where Daniel's family was seated buzzed with laughter, storytelling, and genuine connection as people shared personal experiences and celebrated our union with obvious joy. The most striking difference became apparent during the main course when Charles Morrison stood unexpectedly and asked for everyone's attention. My mother looked alarmed by this deviation from her carefully planned program, but the elderly gentleman's commanding presence quickly quieted the entire room. He explained that he had something important to share that would help everyone understand the significance of this particular wedding celebration. Charles began by introducing himself more completely than he had during the receiving line, explaining that he was the chairman emeritus of Morrison Industries, one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates in the Midwest. The name recognition was immediate among my parents' business-oriented friends, many of whom had probably read about his company in financial publications or heard his name mentioned in connection with major civic projects throughout the region. What he said next stunned everyone in the room, including me. Charles explained that he had known Daniel's family for many years through a connection that few people were aware of. Daniel's grandfather, who had passed away several years before, I met the family, had served in the Korean War alongside Charles's younger brother Michael. The two men had formed a deep friendship during their military service, a bond that had continued throughout their lives despite their very different circumstances after returning home. Charles described how Daniel's grandfather had saved his brother's life during a particularly brutal battle, carrying him to safety despite being wounded himself. This act of heroism had created a debt of gratitude that the Morrison family had never forgotten, and they had maintained a quiet relationship with the Rodriguez family for decades. Charles had watched Daniel grow up from a distance, following his progress through school and into his career with the pride of an honorary uncle. The revelation that Daniel came from a family with such a distinguished military history and long-standing connections to one of the region's most prominent business families clearly shocked my parents and their friends. The assumptions they had made about Daniel's background and worthiness were crumbling as Charles continued his explanation, describing the Rodriguez family's integrity, work ethic, and commitment to community service in terms that commanded respect from even the most snobbish guests. Charles went on to explain that Daniel's decision to work as a mechanic rather than pursue other opportunities had nothing to do with limited options or lack of ambition. Instead, Daniel had chosen his profession because he wanted to serve his community in a practical way, using his skills to help people maintain reliable transportation that was essential to their livelihoods. The Morrison family had quietly supported this choice, recognizing that true service comes in many forms, and that Daniel's work was valuable regardless of its social status. The most shocking revelation came when Charles announced that the Morrison family had established a scholarship fund at Northwestern University in honor of Daniel's grandfather, and that they had been anonymously supporting various community organizations where Daniel volunteered. The implication was clear that the Rodriguez family had connections and support from one of the region's most influential families, completely overturning the narrative of social climbing that my mother had been promoting. As Charles continued speaking, he addressed the issue of worthiness and social status directly, explaining that he had observed many families over the years and had learned to distinguish between genuine quality and superficial appearances. He praised Daniel's character, work ethic, and commitment to making a positive difference in the world, suggesting that these qualities made him an ideal husband for any young woman fortunate enough to win his love. The room had fallen completely, silent as guests absorbed the implications of Charles's speech. My mother's face had gone pale as she realized that her attempts to position Daniel as an unsuitable match had been based on fundamental misunderstandings about his family's background and connections. My father looked equally stunned, clearly recalculating his assessment of his new son-in-law's prospects and social standing. Charles concluded his remarks by announcing that the Morrison family was delighted to welcome me into their extended network of friends and supporters, and that they looked forward to watching Daniel and me build a life together based on the solid foundation of love and shared values. He raised his glass in a toast to our marriage, specifically praising our courage in choosing authenticity over appearances and substance over superficiality. The applause that followed Charles's speech was thunderous, but the responses varied dramatically depending on the audience. Daniel's family and friends cheered with obvious pride and joy, celebrating the recognition of Daniel's worth and the validation of their family's dignity. Many of my parents' guests applauded enthusiastically as well, clearly impressed by the Morrison family's endorsement and eager to align themselves with what they now recognized as a prestigious connection. However, I could see that some of my mother's closest friends were struggling to reconcile this new information with their previous assumptions about my marriage. Their expressions revealed a mixture of surprise, embarrassment, and recalculation, as they realized they had been publicly proven wrong about Daniel's background and prospects. The women who had been whispering about my poor judgment earlier in the evening now found themselves applauding a union that had just been endorsed by one of the region's most respected business leaders. Daniel himself appeared genuinely moved by Charles's tribute to his grandfather and family, though I could see he was also somewhat uncomfortable with the sudden shift in how the other guests were regarding him. He had never sought recognition or validation from my family's social circle, and the idea that his worth was now being measured by his connections to the Morrison family rather than his own character clearly bothered him, even as he appreciated the gesture of support. The immediate aftermath of Charles's speech created a fascinating social transformation, as guests who had been subtly dismissive of Daniel throughout the evening suddenly began approaching him with newfound respect and interest. My father's business associates, who had earlier questioned Daniel's ability to provide for me, now wanted to discuss potential business opportunities and partnerships. The change in their behavior was so dramatic that it would have been comical if it had. On one hand, she was clearly relieved to discover that my marriage wouldn't be the social embarrassment she had feared. The Morrison family's endorsement transformed Daniel from a liability into an asset, someone whose connection to our family might actually enhance rather than diminish our social standing. However, I could also see her struggling with the realization that her judgment had been so spectacularly wrong and so publicly corrected. The conversation at our head table during the remainder of dinner was awkward as my parents attempted to process this new information while maintaining their composure in front of the other guests. My father made several attempts to engage Daniel in discussions about business and future plans, clearly trying to establish a more positive relationship now that he understood Daniel's true social connections. My mother focused on praising Charles, Morrison's speech, and expressing how wonderful it was to learn more about Daniel's family history. Elena Rodriguez handled the sudden attention with characteristic grace, accepting compliments about her family's military service and community involvement without appearing either overwhelmed or vindicated by the recognition. She had always known her family's worth, and external validation from wealthy strangers didn't change her fundamental understanding of their dignity and value. Her composure in the face of the dramatic social reversal served as a lesson in authentic confidence versus the superficial status-seeking that characterized so much of my parents' world. As the evening progressed into the dancing portion of the reception, the social dynamics continued to evolve in response to Charles's revelations. The dance floor filled with couples from both families, and I was struck by how much more integrated the celebration became once my parents' friends understood that Daniel's family deserved their respect. The artificial barriers that had separated our guests earlier in the evening began to dissolve as people found common ground in their admiration for military service, entrepreneurship, and community involvement. Daniel and I shared our first dance as husband and wife to a song we had selected together, and for the first time all day, I felt completely relaxed and happy. The weight of my family's disapproval had been lifted, not because their opinions had changed my feelings about my husband, but because their ability to make me feel ashamed of my choices had been permanently undermined. Charles's speech had accomplished something I had been unable to do throughout our entire relationship. It had forced my family to confront their own prejudices and recognize Daniel's true worth. The father-daughter dance with my dad was particularly meaningful given the events of the evening. As we moved slowly around the dance floor, he apologized for his earlier reservations about my marriage and admitted that he had misjudged Daniel based on superficial considerations, rather than taking the time to understand his character and background. His apology was genuine, though I could tell he was struggling with the realization that his sophisticated business judgment had failed him so completely in assessing my fiancé's worthiness. When Daniel danced with Elena, the love and pride between mother and son was obvious to everyone watching. She had raised him to be the kind of man who would choose service over status and authenticity over appearance, and seeing him celebrated for these qualities by people who had initially dismissed him must have been deeply satisfying. Their dance was followed by warm applause from guests who were beginning to understand the true dynamics of our families and the choices Daniel and I had made. The remainder of the evening unfolded with a warmth and genuine celebration that had been missing from the earlier portions of the wedding day. Guests from both families mingled freely, sharing stories and discovering connections that transcended their obvious economic and cultural differences. The artificial formality that had characterized the beginning of the reception gave way to authentic joy as people celebrated our marriage without the social anxieties that had dominated the earlier interactions. Charles Morrison and the other members of his group proved to be delightful company, sharing stories about Daniel's grandfather's military service and their own experiences in business and community leadership. Their presence had completely transformed the social landscape of our reception, turning what could have been an uncomfortable evening of cultural clash into a celebration of the values that truly matter: courage, integrity, service, and love. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, many of my parents' friends approached Daniel and me to offer more sincere congratulations than they had managed earlier in the day. Several business associates asked for Daniel's contact information, expressing interest in potential partnerships or investment opportunities that could benefit his auto repair business. The transformation in their attitudes was remarkable, though it also served as a sobering reminder of how quickly people's perceptions can change based on social validation rather than personal merit. My mother's friends were particularly effusive. In their revised assessments of my marriage, several of them commenting on how fortunate I was to have found such a well-connected and accomplished husband. Their complete reversal from the morning's gossip about my poor judgment to evening compliments about my excellent choice would have been laughable if it hadn't been so revealing about the shallow nature of their social values. The cleanup after. The reception provided one final opportunity to observe the differences between our families. While my parents supervised the professional staff hired to handle the post-event arrangements, Daniel's family rolled up their sleeves to help with the practical work of packing up personal items and ensuring nothing was forgotten. Their instinct to contribute practical assistance rather than simply delegate responsibility to hired help reflected the work ethic and community spirit that had characterized their approach to our entire wedding celebration. As Daniel and I prepared to leave for our wedding night at a nearby hotel before departing on our honeymoon the next morning, I reflected on the extraordinary events of the day. The ceremony had been beautiful despite the family tensions, but the reception had become something far more significant than a simple celebration. Charles Morrison's revelations had forced everyone present to confront their assumptions about worth, status, and the true meaning of a good marriage. The ride to our hotel gave Daniel and me our first opportunity to discuss the evening's surprises, privately. He was still processing the public recognition of his family's military history and the Morrison family's long-standing connection to his grandfather. While he appreciated Charles's support and the way it had changed how my family viewed our marriage, he was also concerned that people might now value him for the wrong reasons, focusing on his elite connections rather than his own character and accomplishments. I assured Daniel that while I was grateful for the way Charles's speech had transformed our reception, my love for him had never depended on external validation or social approval. I had chosen to marry him because of who he was as a person, not because of his family's military history or their connections to prominent business leaders. The evening's revelations had vindicated my judgment, but they hadn't changed the fundamental reasons why I knew he was the right partner for me. As we settled into our hotel suite, finally alone as husband and wife after the longest and most emotionally complex day of our lives, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this point. The challenges we had faced in gaining my family's acceptance had ultimately strengthened our relationship and clarified our shared values. We had chosen each other despite social pressures and family disapproval, and that choice had been validated in the most dramatic way possible. The transformation in my parents' attitudes toward Daniel and our marriage would require time to fully process and integrate into our ongoing family relationships. While I was relieved that they could finally see his worth, I was also wary of embracing their newfound approval too quickly, knowing that it was based on external factors rather than the personal growth and understanding I had hoped they would develop over time. Daniel fell asleep in my arms as I continued to think about the day's events and their implications for our future together. We had survived the wedding with our love intact and our commitment to each other strengthened by the challenges we had overcome. The public vindication of our choice felt satisfying, but more importantly, we had proven to ourselves that we could weather family disapproval and social pressure while maintaining our integrity and authentic connection to each other. 6 months after our wedding, Daniel and I were hosting Thanksgiving dinner in our modest apartment downtown, surrounded by a mixture of family members who had learned to see beyond surface appearances to appreciate genuine character. The dining table was crowded with dishes representing both of our cultural traditions, creating a feast that celebrated our blended heritage in ways my mother's formal entertaining had never achieved. My parents arrived bearing expensive wine and cautious smiles, their relationship with Daniel having evolved into something approaching genuine respect. My father had even begun consulting Daniel about automotive investments for his business portfolio, recognizing that practical expertise often proved more valuable than theoretical knowledge. My mother still struggled occasionally with our lifestyle choices, but she had learned to keep her criticisms private and focus on our obvious happiness together. The Rodriguez family filled our small living space with warmth and laughter, just as they had filled every gathering since our wedding day. Elena brought her famous tamales along with stories about her latest nursing student achievements, while Carlos entertained everyone with tales from his construction projects and the interesting characters he encountered in his work. Their ability to find joy in simple pleasures continued to inspire me, reminding me daily of the values that truly mattered in building a meaningful life. Charles Morrison had become an unexpected but treasured friend to both of our families, joining us for holidays and special occasions with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed authentic relationships over social obligations. His presence at our table represented the bridge between worlds that our marriage had created, proving that meaningful connections could transcend economic boundaries when people approached each other with open hearts and minds. The conversation over dinner naturally turned to memories of our wedding day and the dramatic revelations that had transformed everyone's understanding of family worth and social value. Charles shared additional stories about Daniel's grandfather and the profound impact their military friendship had on his own perspective about honor and courage. These tales never grew old because they reinforced the lesson that character reveals itself through actions rather than circumstances. Kevin, my brother, had gradually become one of Daniel's closest friends, their relationship developing through shared interests in business innovation and community development rather than family obligation. Kevin's initial skepticism about our marriage had evolved into admiration for Daniel's entrepreneurial vision and commitment to ethical business practices. Their friendship had grown stronger than the sibling relationship Kevin and I had maintained during our childhood years of competing for parental approval. Rebecca, Kevin's wife, confessed over dessert that our wedding had inspired her to examine her own priorities and relationships more carefully. She had begun volunteering at the same community organizations where Daniel and I served, discovering fulfillment in direct service that her previous charity board positions had never provided. Her transformation from social climber to genuine community advocate demonstrated how exposure to authentic values could change perspectives dramatically. The most significant change had occurred in my relationship with my mother, who was slowly learning to measure success by happiness and fulfillment rather than status and appearances. She still occasionally slipped into old patterns of judgment, but she caught herself more quickly and made efforts to appreciate different perspectives. Her journey toward understanding authentic worth remained ongoing, but progress was visible in her increased acceptance of our choices and lifestyle. Daniel's auto repair business had expanded significantly since our wedding, partly due to referrals from Charles Morrison's business network, but primarily because of his reputation for honest service and fair pricing. His success proved that integrity and expertise created sustainable prosperity more effectively than social connections alone. The growth allowed us to hire additional mechanics from the community, providing good jobs for people who shared Daniel's commitment to quality work and customer service. My own career had flourished as I found renewed energy for social work, inspired by the authentic relationships I had observed in Daniel's family and community. The wedding experience had clarified my understanding of genuine service versus performative charity, leading me to focus on programs that addressed root causes rather than simply providing temporary relief. My work felt more meaningful because it reflected the values Daniel and I shared rather than expectations imposed by others. The foundation we established using wedding gifts from Charles Morrison and other supporters had begun funding scholarships for students from working-class families pursuing careers in social service and community development. The program honored Daniel's grandfather's memory while creating opportunities for young people who might otherwise lack resources to pursue their educational goals. Our first scholarship recipients were already making impressive contributions to their communities. As the evening wound down and our guests prepared to leave, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point of contentment and purpose. The wedding day that had begun with family tensions and social anxiety had ultimately revealed truths that strengthened all of our relationships and clarified what truly mattered in building a meaningful life together. The lessons learned extended far beyond our immediate families to influence how we approached all relationships and decisions. We had discovered that choosing authenticity over appearance, character over credentials, and love over convenience created a foundation for happiness that external circumstances couldn't undermine. These principles guided our daily choices and long-term planning as we built our life together. My mother lingered after the other guests departed, helping with cleanup while sharing her thoughts about the evening and our life together. She admitted that watching Daniel interact with his family had taught her about unconditional love and acceptance in ways her own upbringing had never modeled. Her willingness to acknowledge her previous mistakes and learn from them demonstrated growth that gave me hope for our continued relationship. As Daniel and I settled into bed that night, we talked about our gratitude for the unexpected ways our wedding day had transformed not just our own lives, but the perspectives of everyone who witnessed Charles Morrison's revelations about true worth and social value. The experience had proven that standing firm in our convictions while remaining open to others could create positive change that extended far beyond our immediate circumstances. The courage to choose love over expectation had led us to discover a community of people who valued substance over superficiality, creating a network of support that enriched our lives immeasurably. Our marriage had become a catalyst for broader conversations about authenticity, worth, and the meaning of genuine success within both of our extended families and social circles. Looking ahead, Daniel and I felt confident that the foundation we had built through weathering family disapproval and social pressure would sustain us through whatever challenges the future might bring. We had learned to trust our own judgment while remaining open to wisdom from others who shared our values and commitment to authentic living. The pathetic wedding my mother had predicted had instead become a celebration that revealed the best in human nature and created lasting positive change in multiple lives. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from proving others wrong, but from staying true to your own convictions until others discover the wisdom in authenticity over appearance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.